Well, so welcome everyone. Welcome to Pictas Academy. It's really exciting to see you all here. My name's Nikki and I'm part of the management team. Some of the rest of the guys are on, you can see on the screen up there. And I'm also the editor of our magazine. I know that some of you are new to us, so it's great to see where you're from and to find out where you heard about us as well, actually. That's really great. So, okay, let me introduce Pictas to you before I hand you over to Alex, who is doing the webinar on an intermediate guide to astrophotography, and obviously the reason why everybody's here today. So Pictas, we're a multicultural community of photographers, artists and creators, and our vision is to create a community for connection, inspiration and learning. So learning together is really important to us. It's part of our vision, and that's the reason why we started Pictas Academy. So Pictas Academy is where we host our training and where we collaborate with tutors and share knowledge and help the community to grow. If you're new to Pictas, we are very active online and we have a combined audience of over 500,000. We've also got 12 hubs on Vero, and Vero is also one of our partners. There are over 100 members in our growing community, and each month on our website we have about 120,000 page views, which is amazing. You'll also find our magazine online, so if you haven't seen it before, then it would be great if you hopped over and had a look, and maybe one of the guys online can put the link to the magazine. There are, I think, 3 editions available now, so they are free to view, and if you'd like to put a donation in there, we'd really appreciate that as well. Also, I'd recommend you put your email address into the website if we haven't got it already. Then we can keep you updated with training, etc. We've also got a couple of levels of membership which you can look at whilst you're on the website. So we do silver and gold, and there are varying levels of training, regular features on our social media hubs, access to our chats, and you can even have your own page on our website if you're a gold member. So as Pictas, we want to make a difference, and we want to share our passion and excitement for creativity, and we want to engage and support other creatives in their journey, and we'd be really happy for you to join us as a member of Pictas. If you've got any questions about membership, Matteo is online and he's our membership director, and I'm sure he will drop the information into the chat if anybody wants to email him. So without further ado, I'm going to hand you over to Alex, because this is the reason why you're here. If you've got any questions, maybe you could put them in the chat box, and later on we will answer those when Alex has finished his presentation. So I'm going to hand you over to Alex and for the intermediate and advanced photographers, astrophotography. Thank you.
Well, hi, everybody. This is really exciting. Thank you first off to Pictas for having me and letting me share some of what I've learned over the past few years with you guys. Just a quick bit about myself. Born and raised in the mountains of Colorado over here in the United States, and grew up skiing, playing outdoors, and always kind of had a camera of some kind around. I got more serious about photography in high school. I did a couple of years in high school of pretty good level photography courses where we learned about darkroom and all kinds of stuff like that. And then I worked for a local newspaper. More recently, I've dedicated myself to astrophotography. In about 2015, I saw some amazing pictures of the night sky, and I had an old clunky Canon Rebel camera, and I knew that I had to get out there and see what I could do. And from the very first night, and all my settings were wrong. I had no idea what I was doing. I just went out there and kind of hoped for the best. I was shooting 30-second exposures, and I was hooked, even on my very mediocre images. And the bit about like astronomy and how what I was photographing, there weren't just these little random dots, but I started to recognize patterns and really see that oh, this is cool. Oh, that's a planet. Oh, that's a nebula. And even on my not very good photos, it really was exciting to see that there was consistency and a predictability to the night sky, and then started developing the techniques to photograph it. So I figured once, when I was at the point where I could start instructing others and really helping other people to get the most out of their cameras, was at the point where I had already made pretty much every mistake imaginable. That's how I learned, is I just go and get my hands dirty and make the mistakes and try to learn from them. So I've done everything from forgetting batteries to forgetting to turn off or the right settings to even forgetting my camera. But we've worked through it, and I think learned a lot and studied a lot, and I got some good things to share with you guys this evening. So I will share my screen. So my business name, my Instagram name, YouTube, everywhere if you want to find me, is Chasing Luminance, all over the internet as far as I could reach. And today we're going to discuss how to create images like this one. Is just an example. So this is a tracked sky blended with the foreground. It's also using panorama techniques. And we're going to go over things like image stacking and how that can improve your astrophotography, how adding a star tracker can improve things, exposure blending, focus stacking, star trails, which are always really fun, and a little bit of light painting. So what the challenge is, what we're really trying to conquer, is the difficulty of photographing at night, because our cameras were designed, most of them, for landscapes, for weddings, for portraits, for sports. Very few cameras are specifically designed to work with such limited light. So we need to add some tricks and some different things into our standard night photography to really bring things to the next level. And if anyone is looking for instruction for the more basic, like how just to go from novice with not really any idea of how to photograph at night, I would definitely recommend watching Julia's webinar from last month. She did by far the best, like 101 instruction that I've ever seen for astrophotography. So I'm going to be referring to a lot of things that she discussed and trying to build off of that amazing foundation that she set for us. So again, if anyone needs that, definitely go and find that video recording on here. So the first thing we're going to discuss is image stacking. And this is usually the first thing people will generally do after they're comfortable taking a simple exposure of the stars, and they see that it's good and they want to make it even better. So in these three images here, you can see this is just the raw image. This is the raw image edited. Very noisy. It's decent, but definitely not the best. And this is after some stacking. We'll have a more zoomed in version of this later, but just from this wide angle, I bet you guys can see a difference in the colors in the snow. This one has a ton of color noise with these red and green speckles. Over here, it's cleaned up quite a bit. So what is image stacking? Well, it's different than like shooting an HDR, where you're taking different exposures and trying to blend different parts of different exposures into one image. When we're talking about astro stacking, as this illustration shows, it's really taking a lot of images of the exact same thing and using different computer programs to stack them to essentially ignore the noise and preserve the constant good data that we want in our image. And this works because noise in our sensor, when you think about like boosting your ISO super high and it looks all grainy, it's not a constant pattern. You could think of it more like static on an old TV, like the salt and pepper all over the TV that's kind of chaotic. That's what the signal or the noise in our high ISO images are doing. So when you take a lot of these exposures and combine them, you're really telling either whatever program you're using to ignore the randomness and only keep the constant. So in astrophotography, it'll be the stars, the nebula, the galaxy, the dark gases. It will preserve those because those are consistent over every one of the images, and it'll ignore the noise. And it is incredibly powerful at doing that. And of course, the more images you stack, the cleaner your final results will be. And what we're doing is really improving our signal to noise ratio. So the signal is the good light, the stars and everything that you want to preserve. Noise is obviously the different signals that get brought into your image through the high ISO and through the processor. It will add a lot of bad noise, but when we stack them, we can see the difference it makes right here. So this image, and a lot of the images I'm going to be showing you, are shot on an Olympus OMD EM1 Mark III. It's a micro four third sensor, and a lot of people will say that you can't do good low light photography with a micro four third sensor, and that is why I'm sharing these images with you guys, is to show that with the right techniques, any camera you guys are using can produce awesome results. So on the right side of this image, we can see the stars, we can see the little darker bits, but it's so grainy. It's terribly grainy and noisy and just not very pretty. And then after stacking 20 images together, you can see some major improvements here. One is that all of this noise is gone and you're left with just the stars and the gases, but it really improves the details that we're getting. This right side of the image has all kinds of gases and nebulas and different stuff going on, like these dark stripes we see here. Those are giant gas clouds and dust clouds out in the Milky Way. That is a really cool thing to photograph. It brings a lot of detail into your images, and stacking these images really brought that out nicely for us. Here is that more zoomed in example of that image I showed you guys above. I used a program called Sequitur, which is available for PC, and stacked 20 images, and these aren't tracked. And again, these were shot on my old Canon Rebel T2i crop sensor camera with kind of a not great lens, and it still produced some decent results. You can see, especially down in the snow, how it just looks like someone poured salt and pepper all over the image. It's really cleaned up here. Now you still can see a little bit of red and green pixelation. That is the noise, or the color noise. So stacking even more images will help to get rid of this. But this image was underexposed and shot on a not very nice camera, and it still has a tremendous result. You can see the difference here in the night sky from that stacking. Another benefit that stacking has is it can remove planes and other distractions. So our night sky is very polluted with noise, or light pollution is one thing, but we have so many airplanes, so many satellites going overhead, especially with Starlink now, that stacking is becoming a more and more vital part of astrophotography. Because if I just had this one image of Andromeda and I wanted to get rid of this satellite right here and wanted to get rid of this plane, it would take me a half hour using that clone stamp tool or whatever to get rid of it. But then we can stack, and this is just 5 images stacked together, completely gets rid of any of those distracting things and just preserves the night sky that we want to see. And again, that's because just like that noise is random and it gets rid of it, those planes and everything else are random. They only will show up in 1 or 2 of your images, and your processing software will ignore those and just give you your good data. And just with stacking 5 of those images and doing a pretty basic processing in Photoshop, you can get a really nice detailed image. This, of course, was shot on a really long lens with a tracking mount, but excuse me, it shows the process that stacking can do. So how do we do our stacking? How to prepare for it? Well, it's actually pretty simple. If you've watched Julia's webinar and you're comfortable taking images out under the stars, you know the basics. You know, put your camera on your tripod, set your camera up with the proper settings, and then orient it to photograph the part of the night sky that you want. Now, the really crucial part for stacking is that you use an intervalometer or a computer to control your camera. There's a couple different ways of doing this. A lot of modern cameras have built-in intervalometers, so you can go into those settings and customize everything and say that you want to take 20 exposures at 15 seconds and have 2 seconds in between to let it write to the card, and it will do all of this work for you. If you don't have an internal intervalometer, I don't know if you can see very well here, if my blurry background is going to mess with it, but this is a really simple, really cheap remote intervalometer that you can wire up, or you can spend like $40 and get a wireless transmitter, which is nice because you can set this one on your camera and then you can have this one in your hand, and you can even go sit in your car and stay warm and still have control over your camera. So intervalometer is crucial, either built into your camera, on an app, or one of those handheld ones there. And then you start taking your photographs, and remember, the more images you get, the better. There will be a lot of kind of trial and error with figuring out how many images produce the best results. A very simple way of thinking about it is that the wider your lens is, the less images you need to have some good benefit. So if I'm shooting on a 24mm lens, I'll probably stack 10, maybe 20 images. For the guys that are really dedicated to deep space, like I know Steven, my buddy on here is, he's amazing at getting really high detailed images of like nebulas and galaxies and all kinds of crazy stuff. He's stacking hundreds of images, taking hours or sometimes several nights of information and stacking them on the computer. So the longer your lens, the more images you want. The shorter the lens, the fewer images will be just fine. So then once we got our images and we're loading them onto the computer, we really do need a program for astro stacking. So on our PC side, we have Sequitur, Deep Sky Stacker, and I don't know how to properly pronounce that one, but all of these kind of serve a different purpose. For the images I was showing you where you have a sky and a foreground all in one, you really want to go with Sequitur because it has this ability to freeze the ground and stack the ground. And then as the sky moves in our 10 to 20 images we're taking, it has the ability to recognize what part of your image is sky and what part of your image is foreground. It will align them all properly and give you your final noise stacked image. This one, Deep Sky Stacker, is a lot better for if you have a tracking mount and you're wanting to get those nebulas and galaxies. It will handle that for you. It can also do flats and darks and bias frames, which we're not going to get into today. That's like very deep space stuff that is kind of, I don't worry about it too much. That's something, again, Steven does quite a bit of, but it has the ability to process those other files to give you your best image. Some programs that work on both is Pictas, and this is, I forget how much it is. It's like $200 to $300, and it is like the highest level of image stacking software possible. It has all kinds of crazy algorithms. It has the ability for you to load your own algorithms. It's really detailed stuff, but it's an incredibly powerful tool if you find that you're trying to get more into the deep space side of things. The rest of these, the Astro Pixel processor and I don't know how to pronounce that, Serial, it's close. Those are really good, again, for deep space, but they're a lot less intense than Pictas, and they're free. And then another one that'll work on both is simple, good old Photoshop. And it's actually what I find myself using the most if I'm not trying to combine a sky and a foreground in one image. manually aligning them in Photoshop is a nightmare, but if you're just photographing the sky and then just photographing the foreground, Photoshop does a really nice job at auto aligning and then blending them in a way that gets rid of noise. For those of us working just on a Mac, we have Starry Landscape Stacker, which is the Mac version of Sequitur. So it has the ability to recognize sky, foreground, auto align them, and stack them for you. And then SSS is Starry Sky Stacker. It's the Mac counterpart to Deep Sky Stacker. So it's just intended for those images only of the sky. The Mac ones cost about $30 each, but if you are on a Mac, they are brilliant, and I definitely recommend picking those up. So we know about stacking now. We know we want to take a lot of images, one right after another, identical images, combine them in one of these programs, and we'll get a lot cleaner of a result. The next step that a lot of us go to when we're trying to get a little bit more quality out of our images at night is by adding a star tracker. And these images, and if you can see on my screen right here, is the Move, Shoot, Move rotator. And this has been my favorite little tracker to work with for wider angle images. It's not the best for deep space once you're getting into like 200, 300 millimeter lenses and beyond. It's not really intended for that, but it is amazing for that wider angle images. So what does a star tracker really do? Well, because the Earth is rotating, we're limited to maybe a 30-second exposure if we have a very wide angle lens. To offset this, we like to use a tool like a tracker, which actually rotates this camera counter to the rotation of the Earth. And I think, yeah, we can see in these videos, yay, it's playing. We can see the tracker in motion right here. See how the camera's moving really slowly, but it's actually following the stars and collecting images for, I think this was a couple of hours at a time. And so it will keep the stars still. Oh, mute that. It'll keep the stars still, and it will allow you to really increase the image quality. And it does this in a couple of ways. One of the benefits of adding a tracker is that it allows you to rebuild your exposure triangle. Julia did a great job explaining how to find your best ISO, your best exposure time for your camera and lens. So this is a basic example of, without a tracker, if I'm shooting on a full frame camera, about a 24 millimeter 1.4 Rokinon lens, I'm going to be at about 15 seconds, really high ISO, about 6400, and wide open on my aperture. And this will give me a really nice image, really nicely exposed, but it won't be as good as when we're adding the tracker. If we have something like a 14 millimeter lens, maybe we can get 30 seconds at f2.8, which will still be nice, but once we add this tracker, we can change your exposure time to almost anything as long as you have good polar alignment. So you can add the tracker, you can bump it up to 60 seconds. So that's adding one stop of exposure. And then on your ISO, you can drop it to 3200. So you're adding a stop of exposure in your time, and then you're reducing a stop of exposure in your ISO and getting a properly exposed image. And you can keep building it. So we can go to 120 seconds, 1600 ISO, 240 seconds, we might leave our ISO, but then start to close down our lens, and then we can keep going from there. So this will create just in one file, a really, really nice clean image that would be as if you had stacked several in a row. So here's an example shot on that Olympus camera with a 17 millimeter 1.2 Pro lens. On the right side, we have 13-second exposures, 20 of them stacked, and wide open aperture and 6400 ISO. And it's a perfectly nice image. You can see a little bit of these dusty details in the galaxy. The stars look nice. You can see a little pop of nebula. But over on the right side, This is a 4-minute tracked exposure that was blended with the foreground, and you can see a major difference. One is that it's a lot less noisy, even though it's not stacked. It helps the main stars to stand out. Like we can see these ones here, and right behind this tree is Jupiter. But my favorite thing is how much it brings out the core of the Milky Way. It adds all of these gases and the bright spots and the dark spots and really makes it a lot more vibrant. And it might sound funny for an astrophotographer, but when I'm taking images of the Milky Way, I'm not trying to get images of the stars. The stars are easy. I'm trying to get images of the gas, of the dust clouds, of the extra deeper details that are up in the night sky. And adding that tracker does make a huge difference. Here's another example. This was on my Canon R5 with a 35mm lens. This is another stack of 20 images in Sequitur, and it looks really nice, but then we jump over to this image and we can see so much benefit that it's lower noise, and you can see more of that dynamic range and the better color rendition because I was able to shoot it down at ISO 800 versus ISO, I think I was 12,800 here. Because that 35mm lens, I was limited to about a 10-second exposure. So adding that tracker just brings out so much more gassy details and color details. This shows an example. Now, this is just a time lapse. I don't have it polar aligned. I just have it panning with the stars. You can see how it moves just at the right pace for the stars and keeps them still compared to the foreground. And I'm just going to wait because I love when the moon hits those flowers. All right, benefits of tracking number 2, it allows the use of longer lenses for deep space. So these images were shot on my Olympus camera with my 300mm lens. Olympus cameras are micro four thirds systems, so a 300mm lens is a 600mm equivalent. So this is a miniature telescope that we're reaching out into the stars with. This was shot using the Skywatcher Star Adventurer because it is that bigger tracker. It has a counterweight system and it is really meant for deep space. The Skywatcher allows you to use things like auto guiding and hook it up to a computer for some really proper exposures. And these again are many exposures tracked and stacked, blended in, I think I used Deep Sky Stacker for this one, and then processed in Photoshop. So these images without a tracker are almost impossible because you would have to shoot for like 2 seconds at really high ISOs and stack a ton of them. And adding the tracker just really unlocks the ability of those longer lenses. And we kind of discussed this already, but it increases the detail in wide angle images by lowering the ISO, which helps you to raise the dynamic range. These were all shot on the little Olympus camera, but you can see the good colors in the nebulas, the good darks and the bright brights of the gases and the stars in the core. And it just adds so much more detail to it, especially when you get into kind of a longer lens. This was a 45mm, which is like a 90mm equivalent. Again, images like this would not really be possible without that tracker. Another benefit of tracking is that it will correct coma and chromatic aberrations by closing down that aperture. A lot of us have like a 1.4 or a 2.8 lens, and those are super nice, but none of these lenses perform perfectly when they're wide open. This is the 1.2 17mm from Olympus, which is an incredibly great lens, but it still has this the coma, the unshapen stars, how they kind of look like footballs there as opposed to nice round stars. When you close down your aperture, it improves that quality so much. You can kind of see this little purple fringe right there. Over on this star, it is completely gone because we were able to close down our aperture. This is that 35mm Canon lens up in the corner. On the right, we're at 1.8 and we can see really bad chromatic aberration and coma. These stars are nowhere near circles. And when we close it down to f4, because we are able to extend our exposure time and still get a proper exposure, these stars are way, way, way better shaped. And we can also see a little bit of vignetting. If you look in this top right corner, it's darker. In this bottom left corner, it's brighter. That vignetting happens when we have our lenses wide open. When we close them down, it gives you a nice, clean exposure across the field. So lots of benefits to tracking, and it's definitely something worth doing if you want to get the best images possible. So we don't have a lot of time this evening, so we're going to go through this kind of quick. This is our tracker crash course. Start with a medium long lens, something like 50 millimeters is nice because it's not too wide that you can not really get the most use out of your tracker, but it's not too deep because when you are using a longer lens, just everything gets more complicated. You again want to use your cable release. I definitely recommend a wireless one if you can, because every time you touch your camera, you might be adding some vibration to it. Memory card, good battery, all of that stuff. And then once you put your camera or put your tracker on your tripod, you want to get your tripod nice and sturdy, make sure your legs are nice and level. You want to set your tracker to your latitude, because the pitch of the tracker really depends on if you're at the equator, it is a very, very flat pitch. But if you're at the North Pole, it's a lot more vertical. So your latitude has some play in how you polar align. And then you need to align it with the pole star. So in the Northern Hemisphere, we're pretty fortunate because we have Polaris. It is just a few degrees off of perfectly due north. So we can align to that very easily. It's not as easy in the Southern Hemisphere, but there's definitely ways to do it. Paul Wilson is a photographer to follow if you are in the Southern Hemisphere. He is a brand ambassador for Skywatcher and creates amazing images. So he definitely proves that it can be done in the Southern Hemisphere. A lot of trackers will have a small finder hole or a polar scope. In the Move Shoot Move, if you can see on my end, it actually comes with two different methods for aligning. One is a laser, which you can see on my shirt there. It sends a laser beam up into the night sky that you can align with Polaris. The other method is a polar scope, and they both come in this little bracket that you just mount right to the side of the rotator, and it makes polar aligning very easy. So you get your tracker aligned to that North Star, and then you want to make sure everything's really tight. Every single knob you have, you want to cinch down, because vibrations can throw off your alignment or cause your camera to kind of slip on your mount. And then you attach your camera, and then you begin building your exposures. So start off with about 30 seconds. If you don't have any star trails, move up to 60. Still no star trails, you can keep building it to kind of whatever you can figure out with your tracker and camera. Yeah, so once we get our images from our tracker, and we're still trying to build a nightscape image, we want to photograph just the sky and then turn the tracker off and photograph whatever our foreground is. And that really kind of brings up some of the fun work we get to do on our computer, which is exposure blending. So the point of exposure blending is to mix either a track sky with a foreground, or to mix a stacked sky with the foreground. So some people will not even have a tracker, but only photograph the sky and get a lot of stacked images, and then turn their camera to the foreground. They might do this so that they can use like a blue hour blend. So you take images of your foreground either right after sunset or right before the sunrise. And that can add a lot of detail, especially if it's a dark scene you're photographing. A little bit of that blue light flooding the scene can make a really nice image, but you do need to blend those exposures together. And some people will do a light painted foreground, which we'll talk about in a little bit. So again, this will be kind of a quick run through for the sake of time, but for Photoshop blending, which is my favorite tool to use for blending two images together, You'll open up your sky image, which is on the left here. This is that tracked one. And then you'll open up your foreground, which is the image on the right. Using different tools, and this is where I'm going to refer you guys to my YouTube channel, Chasing Luminance on YouTube. I have a video where I show my 3 different favorite methods for deleting the sky out of an image using Photoshop. They're pretty complicated, or they can be pretty complicated. So I'm definitely going to say go to my YouTube channel if you want to see more information on that. But the short version is you delete the sky, and then this whole thing is blank. If we zoomed in on it, you would see just those like checkerboards that Photoshop shows you when the image has no detail to it. And then I use my crop tool to expand the canvas up, creating enough room to drop this guy into this area. And then using layers, as you can see, it might be kind of tough, but on the bottom right, I have 2 different layers open. So I'm dragging my foreground, or no, I'm dragging my sky in behind and dropping it as a layer beneath the foreground layer. Then you can use your crop tool to clean things up. You can adjust things and make custom edits to the foreground and to the sky as 2 different layers to try to make them blend together really naturally, and you can create your final image. So yeah, this is another one that takes some time. There's definitely some frustration involved. Getting around details like trees can be very challenging, but with the right technique and the right amount of experience really trying to do this, it becomes a lot easier, and you actually develop shooting habits that will make your post-processing a bit easier. So there we go for stacking, tracking, and exposure blending. Another really fun thing that we can do when we're photographing at night, and this isn't astrophotography specific, but it's focus stacking. A lot of landscape photographers use focus stacking. A lot of macro photographers will use it. The benefit is that it will increase your depth of field while still using a wide aperture. This was shot in the very middle of the night, and it's a really long exposure. I think it was like 5 or 6 minutes, but I still had to have a wide open aperture because there's just not enough light for me to shoot at something like f8 or f10 to get that full depth of field. So you're going to take images on a tripod to keep everything steady and take several photos with different focus points and blend them in Photoshop. The good rule is to take more photos than you think, because I've gone out for a mission where I wanted like some flowers in the foreground and then some rocks and then a tree and then a mountain. And I tried to do it with like 3 focus points. And when I blended them on Photoshop, you could definitely see that there was a little bit out of focus room in between the different focus points. So very good rule of thumb is just the more the better. Start close, take your exposure, zoom or focus a little bit deeper, another exposure, a little deeper, and do that all the way out until you're focused on these mountains back here. For this image, I chose to go with 2 focus points, one on this rock and one on this hill right here, and it worked out nicely for me. So Photoshop has a brilliant auto align, auto blend feature. My workflow is that I will make some basic adjustments in Lightroom, and then I'll click every image that I want to do my focus stack with. I'll right click, and then I'll go merge to panorama in Photoshop. And then you have to uncheck the box that says blend images together. When you merge them to panorama, the Photoshop will automatically align in case anything got thrown off. If you bumped your tripod or anything like that, Photoshop will automatically align it. And then you can click on the auto blend feature and make sure you have stacked images selected. If you have panorama, it'll be trying to build a panorama. So just be careful with that one. and it will create 2 layers out of your images, and it will custom build the layer mask. If you see on the right side here in the layers panel, the black and white parts are the layer masks that have been applied. So Photoshop did a great job. We can see these rocks are nice and crispy in the front. This mountain is in focus in the back. If you're wondering why it's so hazy, this was shot during one of our wildfire seasons where we get smoke from all over the West, kind of ruins our astro fun for a few months of the year, but we're still able to get out there and get up high and create our final image. So yeah, that is focus stacking. It can be a really nice tool. Then you can add your sky in above it. Just a good thing to be able to use. The next thing we can learn about doing, and this is kind of one of the most fun and I would say relaxing ways to photograph the sky, because once you get your camera set up, it's just a couple of hours of letting your camera do its thing, capturing these images and creating star trails. So this is always good to do if you have 2 cameras set up and you want to have one making star trails, the other one you're photographing whatever other part of the sky you want to. It can be a good way of maximizing your time out in the field. This image here was created on my Olympus with that 17mm lens, and I'll talk a little bit more about it later, but Olympus has a magical tool called Live Composite, and I'll explain why that's so cool later. Another really fun thing about star trails is it's something you can actually do pretty easily with film. This was taken on my old Canon film camera, and this really bright streak up here is a crescent moon. It was really small, but I wanted to use that moon to add all of this light to the foreground and still keep our nice star trails going overhead. Oh, this one got out of order. Yep. So this is, sorry about that. This is my focus stacked foreground, background, and sky blended over top with some nice meteors going. So sorry that got out of order, but we will continue. Okay. This is really showing what we're doing when we're taking photographs of the stars. When we see Polaris right here, it's not moving very quick, so it will just make a really small little circle. The further you get away from Polaris, you can see the sky seems to be moving quicker, and it's making these really long streaks. To make a time lapse like this, you just take all of the images that you capture for the star trails and run them through a specific bit of software and combine them into a time lapse. That software is called Star Stacks, and it has the ability to save a new image after each image has been compiled. So you can kind of count it. It's like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and it will save the progress, and then you can move it into whatever time lapse creating software you want to use. This one was a beautiful evening out. We were doing some backcountry skiing. And again, this is one of the funnest ways to photograph because we're all in there having a good time warming up from the day. And I just ran outside, set up my camera, set it to like 4 hours of images and just let it run. Again, it's like just a fun way of preserving a memory of where you were under the stars and kind of building a little bit of a story with it. So preparing for star trail photography. If you do want to create an image with this nice big continuous circles like this one, you need to make sure that you have Polaris, which is that little bright star right there in the field. So how do we find Polaris? The easiest way, I think, is to find the Big Dipper. It is a very, very recognizable, very large and bright constellation. And if you can consider this like the scoop or the spoon of the dipper, you find the N2 stars on the opposite end of the handle, and you kind of draw an imaginary line out into the night sky. And this, if you hold your hand up at like full width out in front of you and put your thumb on the Big Dipper, it will be just about the width of your hand. And there will be one star that kind of stands out from all the others. Contrary to a lot of myths and what people believe, Polaris is definitely not the brightest star in the night sky, but it is kind of out on its own as far as the brighter stars. So it is fairly easy to find, and the Big Dipper, Ursa Major, is my favorite guide to getting there. So the gear you need for star trail photography, it's really any camera you're using that you want to have manual exposures for. So pretty much any DSLR or mirrorless camera. A lens, you want to have a nice wide angle lens to get those really big dramatic circles. The image I showed you above with the cabin was 24 millimeters, and that's really a nice spot there. And you want to have a good aperture, good wider aperture, like something like 2.8 is nice because it can just gather enough light. You want to have a nice sturdy tripod because it will be crucial to keep your camera completely still for the entire shooting experience. Again, a remote shutter release or an intervalometer. It's the same for the stacking process. It's actually identical to the stacking process. You build your exposure, take a couple test shots, make sure you like your focus and everything, and then set your camera on that intervalometer to run for as long as you'd like it to. And it's goes pretty obviously, the longer you expose for, the longer and more dramatic your star trails will be. But also if you have a longer lens, something like a 50 millimeter, it will seem like you have longer trails, even with less exposure time. So all things to consider when you're planning it. 2 methods for creating star trails. The first one is that you're going to stack photos for your star trails. So this is when you're taking a 30-second or so image one after another for a really long time. The benefits of doing this is that your camera sensor will never overheat. If we are in a warmer climate, like down in the desert somewhere down south, and it's kind of hot out, our camera will produce hot pixels and add a lot of noise if we take super long exposures. So if you're in somewhere like that, you need to take these shorter exposures and then stack them all on the computer. So position your camera on your tripod, find your composition, dial in your settings. I always like to take a couple of test shots and use my histogram to make sure that I'm not overexposing my stars and destroying all the color details that come with them. And then you just let your camera run maybe 30-second exposures, and you want to capture 100 images or more to create a nice big dramatic star trail. And then make sure you check your results maybe as you're going, and because lenses might shift their focus if they were taken from a warm car and brought into a cold area over the time that they are cooling down to the ambient temperature of the environment, the focus can shift a little bit. So definitely make sure that you're keeping on top of it. And then you'll need a computer program to combine your images. Photoshop can work. You can load every image into Photoshop and then create a smart object and blend them in a certain way, but it is really intensive on your computer. Computers don't like doing Photoshop star trails. They can do it, but a lot better way to do it is a free program called StarStax. StarStax is cool because it can give you different effects. Like it can give you something where your trails look like comets. It can save the progress to make a time lapse like the one I just showed you, and it's way easier on your computer. So StarStax is a good one. The other option, and this kind of applies to film photography or if you're photographing in a really dark area, is to use just 1, 2, 3 really long exposures for star trails. Again, it's not the best. Definitely if it's warm out, you'll get a lot of noise and a lot of hot pixels. But if you are somewhere super cold, it can work for that. So this setup is pretty similar, but you need to shoot at a much lower ISO and probably close down your aperture a bit, because if you take really bright image and extend your exposure for an hour or two, it will be overexposed. So definitely something to be careful about. This image here was created using that first method where I'm taking one photo after another, essentially making a time lapse and then processing it through star stacks. You can see that different effect that it gave the stars, where they look more like comets than those perfect circles. And also, this is an example of if you're in the northern hemisphere and you point your camera south. It doesn't create those circles, but it still has a cool effect. And this one here was created using that second method where you're just doing one long exposure. The cool thing about this is that it was shot on black and white film, some expired even black and white film. So it's another cool thing that you can do and get creative and artistic with it. So there we have our star trails. And I am kind of running through all of these things really quickly, and I'll give you guys some information at the end if you have any questions about what we've gone over, how we can get together. Last thing we're going to discuss, and this one will be fairly quick here, is light painting. So really adding any additional artificial light to your scene. Photographing at night, like we've gone over, there's almost no light, especially if there's no moon. So we need to use a few things to create a nice foreground here. This example shows the benefits of using something like low-level lighting. And if you can see in my hand, these two little guys are low-level lighting panels. They can really be used for video lighting or for all kinds of stuff. But the cool thing about them is that they are super dimmable. You can bring them down to just 1% exposure, and it will create a nice cast of light onto your foreground. There's different models of light painting or low-level lighting panels. These are super cheap, newer brand ones. They're like $40 and they work well, but if you want to really invest, there's some that are like $200 that you can dial in exactly like it says 0.008 lux from low level lighting. You can get really, really detailed and they can make nice images for you. But this shows the benefits of adding that low level lighting versus something like a headlamp. Headlamps, you can't control the color. It's either like white or red. And with these panels, you can control the color to really cast that nice natural looking glow upon the scene. You can also use the moon. For this example, I tracked that sky. This is that foreground or that foreground from the time lapse I showed you guys earlier. So I was imaging the night sky and the galaxy with my tracker, and then the moon started to come up. So I turned my tracker off, waited for the moon to pop up, and shot the foreground after that was already up there. This is an example of how you can even use a car to add some light painting. I had my very brave wife drive up this scary canyon in Utah at 3 in the morning. She's very patient with me and all my shenanigans. And I was imaging from the top, and you could see how the car lit up the entire scene. And then again, my tracked and stacked sky was photographed just after she finished with the car, and they were blended together in Photoshop. Here's an example of using a panel inside of our tent to light up the tent from the inside, and then casting just a little bit of light onto these trees. And then we got our nice Milky Way over the top. So adding little bits of light painting can really make a nice difference in your images. Here is an example of very bad light painting. This is not what we want to do. So this was using my headlamp at a very dim setting and kind of waving it over the flowers here in the foreground. And it does not look very pretty. It's an unnatural color. It's super blue where it doesn't match with the color temperature of the stars. It was too close to the subject. It just feels like it's hit with some light, and that doesn't feel natural. It kind of separates the viewer from the experience of the stars. And it didn't paint more of the scene. There's all this field of stars that goes back for hundreds of feet back in that direction. And just using my headlamp was not the way to go here. This is more of an example of good light painting. For this, I actually used, and it was before I got these light panels, I used an app on my phone called Screen Flashlight app. And it is a brilliant little tool. If we know we have the flashlights on the back of our phones, but this turns your actual screen into a light panel, and it allows you to adjust the color temperature. If you can see, the color's a bit different on the left image versus the right image. You can dial that in, and it just turns your screen into the light, and you can change the brightness, the color. And I set this on the settings I wanted and just kind of walked around the field with my phone up and moved it about and painted the entire scene. And by doing this, I was able to create this final image. It's a much more natural feeling light painting. It gives you even color, even brightness throughout the scene. And this can be achieved using your phone, one of these low-level lighting panels, or just kind of waiting for a little bit of moonlight to light up that scene for you. So obviously this is my trail of my light, so I had to do that exposure blending, but this I still consider to be a pretty authentic and natural image because everything was shot with the same settings, the same location, one right after another, and just kind of combine things into creating the final image that would be very challenging to create in just using one image only and not stacking or anything like that. So we are finished. Thank you guys so much for watching. Thank you, Pictas, for the opportunity to be here and share some of my adventures out under the stars. And I hope you guys had fun watching. So real quick, before we get into the question and answer, if anyone would like to contact me directly, again, I'm chasing luminance everywhere on the internet. And I've started working with a company called Colorado Astrophotography, where we are running night sky workshops. So if you're in the Colorado area and want to get some hands-on training, hit up coloradoastrophotography.com. If you are not in Colorado, if you're somewhere like Europe or Malaysia or wherever else we have people visiting from, we run Zoom courses, just like what you're seeing here, where we can sit down one-on-one and discuss exactly what you want to learn about photographing at night. Anything from what gear should I buy to how do I take, whoops, how do I throw my gear on the ground? How do I take the photographs to how do I post-process them? We can hop on Zoom and get things worked out for you. So again, coloradoastrophotography.com will get you to all of our different courses. And with that, I am hitting stop share and being done.
Well, thanks, Alex. That was such an informative and clear webinar.
Oh,
And
1 second, Nikki, sorry. Sorry, I had my end muted. Could you restart there? Sorry about that.
Yeah, I just said, Alex, that was great. It was such an informative and clear webinar. And I just loved how honest you were about, getting things wrong, like forgetting your camera, because it shows how human we all are and everything isn't always perfect. I'm not sure I'll ever make an astrophotographer. There's a lot of prep before, during and after. But I did love how you said that it's relaxing with the star trails. I thought that was just incredible. So we've got some questions. I think possibly we can open up, if people put their hands up with their questions, we can open them up, or I can read them out to you. So Martina says, how much are the star trackers approximately?
The Move Shoot Move with like a lot. So Move Shoot Move is cool because it comes kind of a la carte. You can get and build your tracker exactly how you want, between $250 to up to like $400 with your different components here. Something like the Skywatcher Star Adventure, again, is going to be in that $300 to $400 range, depending on what equipment you get to come with it. They also make much more expensive ones, but there's no reason to get into those right off the start.
That's cool. Frederica, would you like to raise your hand and we can open it up so that you can talk to Alex? Or shall I just, okay, so I'll ask the question for you. Once I shoot in RAW, how can I get a final RAW image after stacking all the shot images? By now, I used ASTAP for DSOS stacking,
Yeah,
SSS
deep
gave,
sky objects.
yeah,
This guy knows what he's talking about.
Yeah, SSS gave back an error message, maybe due to the format. And the possible outputs were a
Yep.
.fit or .tiff file and .jpeg if I remember well. But I know raw format is better for post-processing.
Yes, good question. Go with the TIFF. The TIFF file is lossless conversion, so it still maintains all of the detail and data you want in there. If you go to a JPEG, it compresses it way too much and bakes in everything in there. TIFF is the short answer.
Okay, so thank you a lot, Alex. Great presentation.
Yeah, thank you for watching.
Thanks, Frederica, for the question. Harry, maybe you can open Julia up because she's got a question.
Are we bringing her on to ask?
Yeah, she's got a question for you.
Okay, cool.
Hey, Alex.
Hello.
My question, I don't know if I can't turn on my video, but anyway, my question is, when you are processing and blending tracked images, how do you handle the blurred horizon?
Yeah, there is an issue where you are going to lose a little bit of the sky because you need to drop it down a little bit lower. So the blurred horizon, it just exists, and hopefully you're photographing, like if you have like a mountain that goes like this, you want your sky to be in a natural position. So your blurry mountain will be here, but then when you shoot your foreground, your sharp mountain will be here still. So you're just kind of going to bring your sky a little bit lower. So there will be a little bit of loss right on that blurry edge. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Most of my foregrounds are not mountains. There are things like irregularly shaped hoodoos and things like that. So that technique doesn't work very well.
So, yep, that can be a little bit of a challenge. Another thing that you can do is if you grab your warp tool in Photoshop, you can make your foreground just a little bit larger than what naturally would be, or make your sky just a little bit smaller.
Got it.
So that your sharp parts are bigger, your blurry parts are smaller, and they might fit together a little nicer for you.
Okay, great, thanks.
Okay, so we've got a question from William. Can you do a star trail with a tracker in reverse poles?
Yes. So what he's saying is on all of our star trackers, we have a north and a south setting, which will rotate it this way or this way. So if you're in the northern hemisphere and you want to create star trails quicker or larger star trails in the amount of time, throw it on your tracker and put it in the southern hemisphere orientation. So it will be kind of doubling up the time of the motion of the trails.
Hopefully that answers your question, William. I found another question over in the chat. When will you use laser or polar scope for polar alignment and why? And that's from Ken.
Like one versus the other? Do you think that's what we're going for?
I think so, yeah. Maybe Ken, you can...
So the laser on the Move Shoot Move, there's a couple tricky parts about it. It's not legal everywhere. There's some parts of, I think, the EU and other areas that don't allow this level of laser. So you kind of need to go with a polar scope. I will use the laser only most of the time because it is accurate enough and everything's kind of generalized. It's accurate enough for good exposures. If I'm trying to use like an 85mm lens, I'll probably use the polar scope because you can get a lot more detailed with how precisely aligned you are.
Does that answer your question, Ken? I think Ken's live.
The short version is if you're using a wide angle, go with the laser. If you're using a deeper lens, go with the polar scope.
Yeah, he said thanks. We've got somebody asking you, do you have any recommendations on places to photograph in the Southwest? We're starting in NM on the 10th of the 1st and traveling by fifth wheel to Zion, Valley of Fire, and then through Arizona through March.
Yes, I know what all those things mean. So NM will be New Mexico.
Okie dokes.
Man, down there, there's so many cool spots. One of the best dark sky sanctuaries around is Kanab, Utah. That's where like Royce Bear and the star, I forget, he has a big star conference down there. The Kanab area is really cool because you can get into some different hoodoos there, or you can get into like the canyons around the Lake Powell. And then, yeah, man, all through Zion, Grand Staircase, Escalante, Bryce Canyon, Southern Utah, and Northern Arizona are incredible. I could talk for an hour about locations down there.
It sounds amazing. Okay, James Laskin has asked you, you mentioned a micro 2/3 and a 300mm lens, and it acts as a 600mm. Is it correct that if you have a full frame with 300mm but crop, you can get the same effect?
I'm gonna say no, but kinda. It all depends on your megapixels. If you are like, I have the Canon R5, which is like a 45 megapixel, and I have the Olympus EM1 or whatever. It's a 20 megapixel. So kind of, that's a hard question, and I think it's a lot deeper than yes or no. But I'm gonna go with no, that you want to get your image without cropping as much as possible.
Okay, cool.
Steven's probably there just like, Alex, that's not, no, just say it right.
Okay, so April is asking, I'm traveling to Big Bend in June. I've shot there before, but going to have MSM for the first time. Is the laser allowed there, if you know?
I think so. Yes, I think so. I don't know of any reason why it wouldn't be. Something that any Move Shoot Move people can do is, if they're on Facebook, join our Move Shoot Move Facebook group, and that has people from all over the world, and probably someone in Big Bend has used it and knows for sure.
Awesome.
But my short answer is probably.
Okay. Linda says, what is the name of the phone screen app you mentioned?
It is, let me just double check. I think it's very, very simple. Screen flashlight. The icon is a colored rectangle with a gradient of colors from like every color of the rainbow, and it's called Screen Flashlight. It's brilliant if you don't want to pick up one of these guys.
Awesome.
Okay, I think I got that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
So Rich is asking, what is the website again for Colorado mountain photography?
Yeah, our website, Maggie Martin there, she's in the chat. It's coloradoastrophotography.com. It's a pretty easy one to remember. And yeah, we have different experiences and stargazing tours and one-on-one options on there. And if you don't see what you want on there, if anything's confusing, reach out to me anywhere, Chasing Luminance.
I think Maggie's just dropped it in the chat as well, so everybody can just have a quick look on there as well. Alex, thank you. That was an amazing webinar. Thanks on behalf of Pictas and everybody else that's attended. I'm sure everybody's really enjoyed it. Have a great morning, evening, afternoon, wherever you are in the world. And thanks everyone for joining us. It's been great to host the webinar. Thank you again, Alex. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.